Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we have a very sexual and sensual guest for us today. Well, we are joined by Jem Ayres, who is a sexological bodyworker and tantric practitioner. So what I'm hoping this interview will be is like a window into something that, like, to be honest, like I don't think I've got optimized or really dialed in my life, which is like sex, sexual energy, and that kind of thing. And what I'm hoping Jem will do is add a whole layer to like what can you do once maybe you've mastered your sexual energy, you've got done your nofap, you've taken control of all that kind of thing. How perhaps can you integrate it in a way that's like really good? So I'm personally very excited to hear some of these great insights that Jem has. So Jem, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, Richard. Wonderful.
Yeah.
And it's always exciting to talk to someone else and have conversations, especially around sex and intimacy and pleasure and bodies, because we just don't have these kind of platforms where this is so out there in the mainstream. So it's really great that we're having conversations that start to normalize this topic, actually.
Million percent. And I think it's just another way that the mainstream everything is failing us. And sex is just one of about 400 different topics where it's people like us that are more on the fringes that are like actually doing the work and fixing these things. I'm not saying we're perfect, I'm not saying we have all the answers, but all the answers do seem to be coming from the counterculture at the moment. So let's hope we get a few today.
I look forward to helping out. And I always think that my intention with my work is about if I can, send someone some golden nuggets somewhere, then, my work is complete.
Yeah, so that's interesting because that's the way I see my work too. So like, okay, let's start with this. What do you think is the problem with sex and sexual energy in our culture?
Oh, good question. I think the fact that there's such a void around healthy conversations around it creates the shame and the fear. And if we can't actually ignore sex because it is part of life, but by completely trying to wipe it out and wiping it under the table, we kind of almost go the other direction, which is it's over sexualized and it becomes a taboo. And that
Yeah,
means that instead of having it healthily integrated into our lives, into our everyday, we can kind of get into quite an obsessive state around it.
yeah. So that's so interesting because like you've said on the one hand, well, it's repressed, and then on the other hand, it's like, well, we're actually over sexualized. So how can those two contrarian things be simultaneously true?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's that idea that because we're not talking about it and not talking about it, that's where it gets shifted into the shadows.
Yeah,
So that's how, kind of abuses of power and sexual assault can continue, is because then we're not speaking about it and we're not allowed to voice out about it. We don't know how to deal with it when it happens because we don't have languages around pleasure and boundaries and consent. And so instead of having really healthy sex lives, we've learned about all of this shame around our bodies.
yeah.
So we try and get our needs met in really icky ways. I think we all do this actually. It's, I'm running a couples course at the moment and teaching couples to, instead of offering each other massages, asking and requesting a massage or a touch for themselves, because we're so very good at hiding our needs or our wants as a gift for someone else. So, hey,
Mm.
can I give you a massage? Because actually, what we really want is we really want touch and we really want to touch them and we really want a cuddle. But we're definitely not allowed to express that we have any needs or desires or wants. So
Yeah.
instead, we make it about the other person.
Yeah, so it's like in our culture, we're allowed to have certain needs. Like we're allowed to have status needs. We're allowed to have like money needs and that kind of thing. But we're not allowed to have like sensuality needs, where it's like, oh, I'd like to have a nice blanket over me, or isn't it nice to feel this nice soft mushy thing between my hands, or something that's more explicitly sexual. Like it seems like we don't maybe the hard sex stuff. Now I think about it, we validate a bit more, but if someone says I want to lay under a blanket for 45 minutes, it sounds like the most irrelevant thing, and almost like we Westerners would say, well, why don't you do something relevant with your time instead of a 45-minute complete waste of time? So what do you make about, yeah, go ahead.
Again, with couples, it's easier because we have permission in a couple and almost an expectation when we're in a couple that sex has to be part of it. It's a lot easier to ask for the sex and the kind of higher intensity experiences than it is for the intimacy,
Yeah,
which, the smaller things like the hair stroking and the hand holding, because
yeah,
there's an idea that maybe our partner doesn't want to do that. Maybe that's going to bore them. Maybe that's not what they're interested in. And that's just about me. And somehow I have to give something for them to want to be involved in this exchange. And so when I work with people where there's been sexual shutdown in a relationship, or a couple where there's, you know, different levels of libido, quite often, you know, what I find is not only is there very little sex or satisfactory sex for both people, but there's little to zero intimacy. Because what we've learned is that if we hug someone, it always has to end up in sex further down the line. And we haven't developed the language to be able to stay in the lower ends of sensuality and pleasure. And they're the places that nourish and fuel us, instead of the goal-driven approach to sex in a partnership.
Yeah, so these are great points already. So when you said that, it reminded me of a relationship. I think it was actually a pretty good relationship in a lot of ways that I had a while ago. And it was a long-term one. It lasted about 3 years, something like that. And during the last 6 months, maybe longer than that, like we just stopped having sex. And I remember just like 100% not being interested in it at all. So like you must get, that must be a common thing that people bring to you in your practice.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's very much somewhere I've been as well. As you know, in my 20s, I had sexual shutdown, and you know, I was really very much in love with the partner, but for some reason, whatever, sex just wasn't happening in me. And so when I work with couples around that, I mean, there can be so many different contributing factors, and I don't want to whittle it down to one thing, but one of the biggest things I find is that when we first enter sexual connection with each other, we're very much reliant on the chemicals that fire off in our brain when it's new and when it's interesting, when our partner's new to us. And we kind of fire off on that, which can quite often lead us to the higher intensity, penetration focused, goal driven approach to sex. But we don't learn the other smaller steps which keep a relationship and a sexual appetite going over a long period of time, which is the intimacy, which is the eye gazing, which is the hair stroking and the breathing together, and the non-sexual touch, or the touching of the other parts of the body which aren't genitals, which might not seem sexy, but can be super, super sexy. So none of us have learnt that skill, because if we think of where our sex education comes from, it comes from peers who have had just as little education as we have, or generally pornography. And pornography has just a very limited view on, it's got a very, very limited view on what sex is. And there's no problem with that kind of sex, but I know I'd get super bored if that was the only way I was having sex. So it's like, how do we open up our range of experiences to be able to try something new and dare think outside of this very small box that we've been given to say that's sex, and anything outside of that is a bit strange.
Okay. So you would have seen everyone on all sides of the spectrum and perhaps experienced it yourself, all the way from terrible at sex all the way to like, oh yeah, these people are like some of the best paragons of sexual energy I've ever seen, right? And hopefully you're close to that because this is your domain and you've spent a lot of time.
I like to think so, but who knows? Maybe not today.
Well, I mean, probably. I mean, for most people, most of the time, if you just spend a lot of time on something, like you get pretty freaking good at it, you know. And so, you know,
isn't it 1,000 hours? I've definitely spent more than 1,000 hours.
I think the number's 10,000.
Okay, I might have to notch up a few more. But what I recognise is people who come to me and think they're actually bad at sex, it's not they're bad at sex, it's just they haven't given themselves permission to really explore what works for them, you know. So when people ask me how to become a better lover, I think they want me to teach them touch techniques, like how to, you know, masturbate a partner, how to touch a body. And I can definitely teach that. But first, what I want to teach them is how to be with their own body and their own experience, and how you can get direct pleasure from sensations in your own system instead of the indirect approach, which is if I turn a partner on, then I get turned on, which is, again, you know, quite a big contributor to where sex lives can dwindle, is if we're always trying to turn the other person on for our satisfaction. That creates a lot of performance anxiety, for example.
Yeah, I've had that, man. Totally. Like, do you think that's common with guys who like? Because I always think like, oh shit, she's got an orgasm before I do, you know. Like,
well, I think it's common. It works on both sides. You know, men really want to make the partner's orgasm, which on one level sounds super generous and loving. But what that also does is it gives the woman, the female partner or the other partner, performance anxiety that suddenly, shit, I have to orgasm for their enjoyment, for their pleasure.
Yeah,
I don't think both of us don't orgasm, when does sex end? And if we're in a lull, are we allowed to pause and breathe and change our mind, or change it up, or just say, stop, let's have a cup of tea and do something else instead?
Yeah, so good points there, but I don't think it's generous at all, because like if you really peel back the reasons of why I want my partner to orgasm, it's because I want to feel all right about myself, and you peel that one level underneath, and it's like, well, I don't quite feel okay about myself, but I can do this in order to feel good. And I think if two people are like behaving like that, like it's not really coming from the right place, is it? It's coming from two people trying to get their self-esteem needs met from something which isn't from where real self-esteem should come from.
So we can call that taking. We're in taking energy. And this is from
Yeah.
some work by a woman called Dr. Betty Martin, who works on something called the wheel of consent, which I highly recommend everyone learning about. But when it came out a few years ago, it really transformed how sexuality professionals work, because it's about the kind of touch that we give and the kind of touch that we receive. And often when we're touching someone else, the idea is that we're touching them for their pleasure and their experience. Again, a bit like giving someone a massage. But if we're trying to get someone off for our own pleasure, that's actually us taking. And that's not a bad thing. Like, taking gets a bad reputation. So outside of consent, taking isn't good. But actually, if I'm really open and say to my partner, God, I really love your body, I just want to spend 5 minutes touching your body so I can get pleasure from the experience. Are you in for that? And they could be like, yeah, either I'm super into that, or, well, I don't know if it'll be my biggest pleasure, but I've got willingness. Let's see. And
Yeah.
actually, then the partner can step into the experience knowing that it's for me, even though I'm touching them. The pleasure is for me.
Yeah, great point. So I've been with both types of partners, right? I've been ones that are like, just like, oh, if it's cool for you, then I want to do it because it's such a nice thing to, for you to feel good. And then there's other ones that like have this idea. It's like, oh, well, what's in it for me? Like, why are you just taking what's in it for me? And I feel like if you have the first attitude, like, everyone enjoys it and there's this good back and forth. And then, but the second attitude is just, it's like the least sexy thing in the whole world, I think, for everyone.
I think if we're in that place of, I don't know what it's in it for me, what we can then work on is expanding our willingness. So it's like,
Yeah.
okay, it might not be my cup of tea, but what would make me more willing to step into this?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
maybe it's, I need to know that we're only going to do this thing, whatever it is, for 3 minutes. Don't give a partner. So I've got a partner who really likes touching my bum. And there's days where I'm like, yeah, touch my bum, I love it. And there are other days like, man, I'm just trying to do the washing up. But actually, what I notice is I can like, do you know what? If you want to touch your bum for me, for yourself even, then yeah, sure. Like, I can do that for 3 minutes. Any longer than that, I might get a bit agitated. So I don't want to step outside of that window of willingness, because that's when we start to shut down a bit. And that's when we start to feel like it doesn't feel right for us anymore. Or we get a bit resentful because our partner's receiving loads of pleasure from it, and we're just kind of like in a place with it.
yeah.
So again,
So
it's just being really clear on, why am I doing this action? Is it for you or is it for me? And owning it.
Well, yeah, I think it's like both, man. Because like, if I can do something that makes my partner happy, like, I feel pretty good about it. Like, and there's a lot of nuance with that, and there's a lot of back and forth. But like, generally speaking, if someone, like, even not in a sexual way, if just someone said, "Oh, can you help me with this thing?" Like, it makes me feel really good to help them, because it's like, oh, made that person's life better. And like, even if there's nothing coming back, I just like feel really good, because it's like, what, like these videos, for example, like, sometimes like I put some good bit of content out, or someone like sends me a message and they're like, oh yeah, this really helped my thinking and I was able to do this. I'm like, fucking yes, like, so like, I feel similar to that with sex. Like, it's when you look at it like that, it's not clear where the boundaries are between, like, what's for you and what's for me.
And again, that's indirect pleasure, which is great and fine. But if that's the only way that we experience pleasure, then we're just a bit out of balance and we're a bit limiting ourselves, actually. So when someone, I get lots of people come to me and they'll say, oh, I'm such a giver in sex. That kind of sets up a little bit of a warning sign in me, actually. I'm like, okay. Because what I want to do is I want to have people who can be in choice, whether they're a giver or whether in that moment they're actually really able to take or really able to receive instead. And so I work with a lot of people about, okay, if you see yourself as a giver, is that only because that's your only way of receiving pleasure? And if it is, let's work on how you can receive, how you can be in the more, because receiving ultimately is in quite a vulnerable place. And so especially when I work with men who identify themselves as givers, that can often be away from them stepping outside of a vulnerable place, because the receivers are generally seen as the person that is the most vulnerable or the most passive, maybe.
Well, I mean, just not in sex so much, but in coaching, one of the challenges people have with receiving is like if you're opening up to receiving, that means a necessary dissolving of boundaries. And when you dissolve boundaries, you open yourself up to both good stuff exchanged and abuse. And then adjacent to that is the neediness. So like I think like we are in a satanic clown world at the moment where kind of abuse and narcissism probably are actually the dominant cultures at the moment. So like people are used to opening up and like, okay, this good thing can come in. And what they found is when they do that, some abuse goes on. Again, I'd be interested to hear what the parallels are with sex on this. But that's what I found with a lot of clients and myself actually being ready to receive, because usually the receiving comes with strings attached. It comes with like guilt, obligation, or like, yeah, you're gonna get it, but like there's gonna be some emotional like assault that I'm gonna get you with. Does that resonate with your work?
I teach a lot around tit for tat. You know, oh, if I give something, if I receive something, I have to give, or there's a taking, or I have to give something in return. And so it's really valuable in, you know, as in sex, you know, what happens in sex happens in life as well. When we notice our patterns and our habits in sex, whether we're the giver or the overgiver, or we're not able to receive, this will be happening in other areas of our life as well. So we're always going to start with sex and then go, okay, where else do we need to change this? But again, with couples, a lot of the idea of not being able to receive something they really want is the fact that then they might have to give something in return. And maybe they might have to give something that they're not really that bothered about, especially if they think they're asking for something that they think their partner's not really into giving. So it's that whole tit for tat idea. And so when I teach couples and I give them practices, you know, practical touch exercises to do where one's a giver and one's the receiver, I always say to them, look, you know, when the timer finishes and the practice is over, you don't have to then swap over straight away. Like, give it a couple of days. We can learn to fully receive and be in our experience without then having to, you know, jolt ourselves out of this nice, soft, yummy space to, you know, to give if we're not willing, or if we're a bit tired, or if actually we just want to bask in the after effects of fully receiving in that moment as well. And it's really good for the person who's giving to also learn that, oh, maybe I will get what I need, but not today. So then we can hold our sexual charge and sexual energy.
Yeah. So it's really interesting to me that like throughout these little talking points we've already had, I think the shadow of selfishness has overshadowed like all of these things. And I don't know if any of our audience members are into Kabbalah or if you're into Kabbalah at all.
I know a little about Kabbalah, yeah.
Okay, so the sphere that I guess we're mostly going to be talking about today is like Netzach. It's like number 7. It's where like Venus, that type of thing. And each of these, well, most of these spheres have like vices and virtues. And it's interesting because the vice of Netzach is selfishness. And it's really interesting how that's just been coming out here when we're looking for examples of how to express our sexual energy poorly.
Yeah. And also a lot of my work is actually allowing ourselves to be selfish, but owning it. Because otherwise, if we don't own it, we find really funny, round the back kind of ways of getting our needs met anyway.
Yeah.
If we don't have intimacy and sex and pleasure and touch, we don't get the chemicals that fire off in the system, which actually keep us healthy and happy and sane, you know, and keep our nervous system regulated. So it keeps our immune system going. And, you know, our body thrives off receiving touch.
Yeah.
And if for those of us that aren't, even those of us who are in relationships, the kind of touch that we need isn't always meeting our needs. So we try and fill that void in other less healthy ways, whether that is stretching boundaries and going outside of the relationship to meet those needs, whether that's touch and sex needs, or whether it's overeating or drinking or numbing out or internet shopping, whatever our little vices. But we have those needs and they need filling. And if we don't get them filled in a really clean, clear way where we ask for what we want directly without shame and fear, then we'll find other ways which are less helpful to get those needs met.
No, great points. So like, what do you think the benefits are if people are getting their sex right within like a relationship? What kind of like psychological, emotional, physiological, even spiritual benefits do you normally see coming from that?
Oh, Richard, if I'm a well-fucked woman, I'm a much nicer person on this planet.
That's good.
Everything is better. But also, and it's not that challenges don't come in life, it's just that we can meet them from a more grounded and centered place. And when
Yeah,
we're talking about pleasure, what I kind of want to bring home to is embodiment in
yeah,
pleasure.
yeah.
Because actually, if we're really in our body with our experience of pleasure, whether that's self-touch, whether that's partner touch, and it's about the direct experience of sensation in my body, then we've created an anchor in ourselves. So that
Okay.
means that we can make better choices. We could be a nicer person. We're not going to be so responsive to things that are challenging or people that are challenging. We just generally have a bit more space to kind of digest and process information before we react to potential clashes outside of us.
Do you know what was resonating when you were saying that is like when I get myself or my clients to have really good energy from like good training, cleansing, working hard on their business, whatever it is, right? And their energy's good. It's what you're describing there, where like the challenges still come, but you bat them away really easy. Like the abusive individuals come, but they're easy to bat away. And then when that's really good, usually you take delight in the really small things. Like you're just like, oh, that curtain looks really good, and oh wow, this coffee I'm sipping is actually amazing. And I think the opposite is true when your energy's done in. Like even the best things, like just taste of dust, and there's nothing good in anything. And I wonder if we're actually talking about the same thing there. And sex like fills that same central bucket that manifests in all those different ways.
Yeah. Do you know what? I get so many people come to me when they're just completely depleted and
Yeah,
maybe they haven't had touch or sex or intimacy in a very, very long time. Or maybe they have, but it hasn't been what's been nourishing and fueling for them. It's just going through the act, if you like, out of
yeah,
duty, or we feel that we should, or we don't know another way of doing it. And one of the things I talk about is what keeps you in the minus of the pleasure scale. And what I mean by that is if our body's at 0 on the pleasure scale, that's when we're relaxed and neutral and open to an experience. And then we've got pleasure 1, 2, 3 to 10 and probably beyond. And the ones and the twos are the low levels, like you said, about, the really good cup of coffee, or the, dipping into the bath, or the nice clean sheets that you sleep in. And you can really start to bask in those. But we don't pay enough attention to those because we don't see them as sexual. And, we've been taught to be productive and do better things with our time. So
yeah,
part of my thing is getting people to recognize what are your low level pleasures and why aren't
yeah,
you doing more of those and basking in them. But even before we get to 0, before we get to a place where our body is like neutral and open and able to receive pleasure, even low level experiences, I talk about the minus in the pleasure scale, and that's the places where we are depleted. So what keeps us in our minus? For me, it's if I haven't had enough sleep, if I'm cold, if I'm stressed, I'm going to be a far different sexual beast compared to when I'm happy and on holiday and it's sunny.
yeah,
And also other things, medication, previous traumas, conditionings that we've grown up with, messages that we receive on a daily basis. All of these things are going to contribute to whether we are, really holistic in our body and our embodiment and our approach to pleasure.
yeah.
So identifying what keeps you in the minor scale, just so that we have awareness around this.
Yeah,
It's
that's
a
so
good way
cool
to
what you're
change
saying.
it.
Sorry to cut in so early. So what I like what you're saying about that minor scale, because like, I mean, again, it's something that I talk about in my coaching practice, but not specifically about sex. So if people are in like narcissistic relationships, if they're taking like too many environmental poisons in, if they're masturbating and like watching porn and that kind of thing, maybe we'll certainly talk about that later. But if they're like not living up to the best version of themselves, not putting good boundaries in place, that kind of thing, like that leads to that minor scale. And then like life seems to grate on you, like there's no oil, so again, I see these parallels with like what you're saying that's explicitly sexual, but also with these other things that, from other personal development domains.
So I know in my own personal life, there are so many things that contribute to my pleasure life. Because if we run around working our arse off 9 to 5 in an
Mm,
overly stressed, underpaid environment, like most of us probably are, and then suddenly it gets to the evening or a Friday night and we're meant to be in pleasure, It's just not really so available for us because we've been in an anxious state or an overtired or overworked state all week. We can't just switch on because the rest of the week we're kind of almost having to back pleasure away to like nose to the grindstone and get on with life, you know. And then suddenly we don't practice pleasure on a daily basis and then wonder why we're connecting with ourselves, our own body, or with any partners, that it's just not working for us. So I know things that work for me is I try not to work till midday so that the morning is mine as much as possible. I juice, I yoga, I try and keep my body physically as healthy as possible. You know, I try and practice a good bit of sleep hygiene. I could polish up on that if I'm honest, but I know that my body responds really well if I look after it. And then what happens is my sex is even better. Again, whether that's self-touch or partner touch, because my body can be more open, because it feels safe, because it feels nourished, and because it's got less of the things that keep me in the minor scale. And again, sexual energy, I've spoke quite a lot about partners and couples, but actually the majority of my work is with people who are solo and single, because sexual energy isn't just something that we save for another person. It's like, how do we have sexual energy every day, running through our whole lives, just in our own system? And what are the benefits that can be, you know, from that as well?
Okay, let's dive into that, because that would express me. I'm a single person currently, and where I've got to in life is like, I find that I'm really at my best with my sexual energy when I really sublimate it, when there's no porn, no masturbation, and this thing builds up in me a little bit every day. And things tend to work really well. I tend to be luckier like that. I tend to have like better insights with my work. Things tend to go my way. And then how you're describing the minor scale takes place when the opposite is true. So, but like, you know, in having practiced that kind of like stoic, that stoic thing, which I think is a truly important, necessary pillar in the sort of personal development portfolio, I feel like I'm kind of getting to the end of it, or like at least as far as this chapter goes, and I'm like, okay, passion is also a part of it, sensuality is also a part of it. So what do you think? How do you think? And I know lots of people in my audience are going to be in my bracket where they're loving the stoicism, they're getting loads of power from the nofap and the sublimation, the sexual energy. How do you think someone like me can step forward from that place into like this unknown world of like sensuality, sexuality, and maybe using our sexual energy in a way that isn't just purely stoic and sublimated?
Yeah, beautiful question. Thank you. Because actually learning that discipline of, you know, not being so driven by sex and desires is really very valuable, because what that does is it opens us up to more choice. Because otherwise, if we're always driven by sex, then we're not really into choice. Whereas now you've experienced, or whoever has experienced, a period of time where you've set yourself a discipline, and you'll have learned lots about yourself in that experience. And now it's like, how do I now loosen this up a little bit so that I can choose whether I'm, you know, in my like fully expressive in my sexual energy, or whether it is more of a contained sexual expression just for me, or whether it's just, you know, actually I'm holding it for something else. So what I teach when I teach self-pleasure, because I'm not actually a fan of like no masturbation, but it also depends what you mean by masturbation. Because the way I teach people to touch themselves, it isn't always about genitals, and it's not about the goal. It's about how can we feel pleasure anywhere in the body. Because our skin is our biggest erogenous zone, right? The cells on our, you know, the pleasure sensors are everywhere. So it's not necessarily a sexual experience that you want to give yourself, but maybe it's something that's nourishing instead, or supportive, or sensual, or something else. So it might be, if we think again about the pleasure scale, if 10 is orgasm, I would say stay well away from the higher intensity end and really give yourself those places of the lower end of the scale, which might not seem sexual or arousing and might not involve the genitals, but it is more the soft touches, the feeling the warmth, the breathing in heat on the skin, that kind of thing, and allowing yourself to bask in those, because they can totally become sexual, but without the goal of having to get somewhere or achieve erection or arousal or to ejaculate.
Okay, so what I'm getting from this is like, actually don't necessarily think about the sexual stuff, but validate the sensuality. nice warm feelings, like stroke your skin or whatever it is that feels nice for you, and like practice sensuality, to
Yeah.
get those first few steps along that way.
And even maybe before sensuality, it's nourishment and
Yeah,
support. Like, what does
yeah,
my body need from me right now? Because so often we go to masturbation or, or partner sex as well to fill the void. Like, oh God, I don't feel very good. Let's have sex to fire off the chemicals in the brain, which fill that void and let me know I'm okay. Let me know I'm safe. And they let me know that I'm wanted and I'm loved. It's actually, how can we self-resource? And so often when we reach for sex, or partner sex or self-touch, we're not doing it for the want of connection or showing love or self-love. It's to, release tension or to go to sleep or to release frustration and anger. Yeah, I do that too. Like, that's okay, actually. It's just, if that's all that we're doing and we're not recognizing the bigger spectrum of what sexual energy can give us, again, then we're just limiting ourselves.
okay,
So
great
focusing
point.
on the smaller things, focusing on how breath changes our experience of our body.
Okay,
What happens in the body when we're not touching ourselves and we don't have the stimulus from the outside, whether that's fantasy or pornography or partner's touch. Because we've been taught that pleasure comes from the outside, whether that's our touch or a partner's touch or fantasy or porn. But actually, pleasure's kicking off in our body all the time. Even if we're in pain or anxiety, there's going to be a part of our body where we're going to feel somewhere some pleasure.
totally.
And so it's tuning into that.
Okay, so like you said a moment ago that like you're not an advocate for no masturbation, and it's interesting because there's two women that I've interviewed on this channel that have both said that. And like my experience, I'm not undermining what you're saying at all, because you obviously know your craft and you've found out what works, right? But for me and my clients, which are like 3/4 male, I found the opposite. I found like just stay away from that stuff. Like, and then the longer you manage to do that, the better it works, and you can just see that graph ticking up. So I wonder, like, what I asked those other like female sex expert people is like, do you think there's a gender difference there in how masturbation works?
Good question. I
Shouldn't
do.
say
So I
women,
have
actually.
supported men who have chosen the no-fap route and helps them with this. And I've got phone calls for, I hear like day 21 gets super cosmic, basically. Like, so I hear the benefits of it and
Yeah, it
from
works.
experiencing it for an amount of time until it feels good for you.
Mm,
And I'm wondering, is there a difference? I think there's different conditionings with
yeah.
people in male and female bodies, which has led to a different way of touching ourselves. And maybe
Okay.
there's less these days it's different, but those of us in female bodies, for sure, it's less of a thing, or it's not spoken about so much, about self-touch. Whereas men, it's almost expected. Boys are kind of just expected that masturbation is what 15-year-old boys do, right?
They
And we
do.
don't
It's
really
mental.
consider that girls ever do it. And yeah, stuff is now definitely changing, and that education is more out there. And there are now groups and circles where people can share and speak and learn about this stuff. But yeah, I do think that men have a different approach to sex, or can have a different approach to sex and self-touch, because of the conditioning of having to maybe be productive and to do and to be the giver and to be the active one.
Yeah,
Whereas
yeah.
men
Okay.
are more in the passive, if you like, and the receptive.
Well, so that's a really good point, right? And I think there is a societal message from that, but I also think there's something that's independent, that's objective, and not
Mm,
societal from that, where men of all ages, like, we are active in the manifested world, and we're sort of less active in the first few tiers of the spiritual world, and women, of course, are the opposite in that, traditionally speaking. And but I feel like with us men, like the more that energy builds up, like the better we are. And I feel like the world responds to, like, me especially, like I find the world responds to me much better like that. And when I am passive and when there's just none, it's like the energy's just been sucked out of you. Like men, women, everyone just don't like you as much. And I tell you, like if I just had like a good old masturbation habit with some porn for like the next like 2 weeks, the women who are much more like emotionally sensitive, who pick this stuff up before the men, they get this like low key contempt for you. And I do, I do think there's a societal thing about like, the action oriented male thing, but I think it's deeper than that. I think like on a deeper archetypal spiritual level, like we just know that men that don't have that energy in them, like there's something missing. Like what do you make of that?
Do you know what? I recognise, I'm relating it to my own porn habit. And this was about 15 or so years ago, which was the phase of life where I was a porn user, or avid porn user, I suppose is the word. And it was when I was unemployed, and it literally was when I was at my lowest, I was reaching for pornography to fill the void. Because actually, the orgasm and the release that occurs in the brain made me feel a bit better. And it's temporary, but it worked for me in that time. And what I notice with the difference with men and women. So if we go from the Taoist approach, for example, they speak about how there's a masculine approach to sex and a feminine approach. And again, we don't mean male and woman in this context, but the idea is that if we're balanced, we're going to be able to be in choice around experiencing both. And the masculine approach is very much, again, like I said, the doing and the active. And the feminine is the surrender and the receiving and the softening and the slowing and the doing less. And that's the part of sex that isn't well practiced. And again, in pornography, what we're kind of shown is two people actively doing. So neither one's actually in the feminine of sexuality. And so it just kind of becomes like a rutting, if you like. And, it's fine to do that every now and then for sure. But you're missing something if that's all that you're doing. You're missing the softness and the surrender and what can happen in the body when we stop the active or the goal-orientated approach. I run a women's book club, and it sounds very cute and quaint. It's all about female sexual empowerment. And I was talking, I think this was last night or the night before, to the group, because quite often women ask me, how do we work on our pelvic floors? How do we, contract like the Taoist ninjas do? And I'm like, do you know what? It's less in the doing. It's more about actually, if we relax and relax and relax, our vulvas do it for us. Our vaginas do it for us. It's not like we have to squeeze and tense, squeeze and tense, squeeze and tense and practice for 30 times a day or whatever it is. So actually, our bodies do it for us if we allow ourselves to soften.
Yeah. So I think male and female energy is at its best when the male is an active doer and the female is a beer. And I think when those two contradictory energies met, like there's chemistry and there's like steam is made.
I like the option of both. And I also know that when I'm in my softness, actually I can kind of swing between being really soft and active as well. So like when I'm in my active, it might not look like from the outside that much is happening, but I know lots is going on in my body, and my partner knows that as well, like feels that,
Yeah. Okay. So shifting gears slightly, we've mentioned porn a few times in this interview, and like genuinely, if I was ranking the problems that come up in life coaching, right, porn would be a top 5 problem, and just the sheer depth and vastness of the damage it causes. I don't think it's always damaging, right? Just like even like heroin isn't always damaging, or like like a tobacco isn't always damaging. Sometimes it's delightful, but they tend to be. And I think porn is one of those things that tends to be because the damage in porn is I think nearly exclusively in the psychological, the emotional, and mostly actually in the spiritual. I think we Westerners that are materially oriented find it difficult to measure the damage and appreciate it. So what have you seen from porn? What's your experience of like the dark side of porn, perhaps, with your work?
Oh gosh, I remember coaching someone who'd had they were early 20s, and they'd had a porn addiction since they were 10 because of, the early, just like, internet porn is now so out there and so readily available for everyone. And I know I'm not a fan of porn because I know what it does in my own system and the switch that it creates. And I know there are a lot of other sex coaches that say, no, it's great for a Kickstarter, or it's great, or it teaches you stuff. And that there's positive porn, or there's porn which is by female directors or female-led porn. But again, it's just very narrow. It's very narrow. And if we say 95% of the pornography that's out there isn't helpful, because what it's kind of doing is it's hitting us at our weakest point, which is connection and intimacy. 9 times out of 10, when we're reaching for porn, we're reaching for connection and intimacy. Underneath it all, that's what we're wanting.
So we're reaching for connection, and actually we're finding even more disconnection from this addictive cycle that we've got with this like false friend to connection. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, and it imprints something in the brain. It's different to like reading erotica, for example, which is our own imagination creates the story really, or the images, whereas this very much imprints something on the brain which you can't then unsee, you know.
Yeah.
And if we then use that, if that's our habit to reach arousal, and especially if we're single and that's our thing that we do for a while, and then we get into relationship where we do want to start connecting with people, what often means is that that neuro pathway of arousal is so entrained to go to visuals and go to imagery and go to pornography, which is, you know, very well edited to feed to exactly what we want to see. And real life isn't quite like that. And so what happens then, and I've had this before, I've had this with someone, it was the first time that we'd had sex, and after sex I just said to him, you watch porn, don't you? I could tell because he wasn't there for quite a lot of the time, and he had to like think himself into the experience. He was still having to reach for that hook to create arousal, erection. Was actually, it would have been better just to say, let's pause, let's slow. If we're not into this, like, let's do something else, you know.
So there's a few good points in there, but like what one that you said just there is like, actually it's a misappropriation of the intellect, and like you're in that acute function of the psyche rather than in that cloud of being that I think like sexuality best manifests itself. And that's it. Like the porn is so skin deep and it's intellectual, and I think that's what one of the disadvantages of it that so many people it's hard to spot. But another one is on top of the great stuff you're saying about like the brain stuff, and like, you know, you could go into the dopamine and all that kind of thing. I think a warping of the psyche takes place where you're sloshing around all this really intense sexual energy, and like you, brain aside, the psyche gets a little misshapen and a little bit out of sync because you're putting all these big currents in all the different ways, and then that has this knock-on effect through the sort of like, you know, the mainstream sort of Western psychological psyche, and then the manifested world. And case in point, you can tell that like when people watch porn a lot, their faces don't look as good. It looks I've seen it in mine, like from the times where I'm like doing nofap, it looks like, I guess, more classically masculine, and like I look at it in the mirror, I'm like, yeah, that looks good. But like if I'm watching lots of porn, there's a porn user face that's just not quite right, that starts to manifest, and I think that comes from a misshaping of the psyche that takes place. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, porn teaches us so much. Porn teaches, there are so many messages that we don't even notice when we watch porn that we get, and then we're with a real human in connection, and what happens is the brain kicks in and goes, this isn't right, because it's not like that thing that you've been watching for 15 minutes every day for however many years, or whatever your porn practice is. And I also know that other people talk about, no, porn is just a tool and it can be used in a healthy way, and if you stand up and if you move with it and all the other stuff. But for me, it's very limiting. It's still just quite limiting.
Yeah, I think we're on the same page of that one. But I really appreciated the beautiful way you sort of like explained that and expanded those subsets of it. It was very cool. So adjacent to that then is like sexual fetishes and that kind of thing, where people like go into these like interesting eddies of things that don't appear to have anything to do with sex, but might just consume all of someone's sexual energy. Like, how do you find people like grappling with that kind of stuff?
Gosh, this is opening up a minefield. So there's just so many different things that can be spoken about when it comes to, let's call them sexual kinks. So first of all, what is a kink? It's anything that's outside of the very narrow window that society has told us is, you know, okay sex, basically. So it could be anything, but you know, it could come from childhood longing, where we again haven't had a need met and found it another way in childhood. It can come from a peak experience. There's a guy called Jack Morin who's written a book called The Erotic Body, and that talks about our peak erotic experiences. So like our first most sexual experience that might not involve sex. It might just be, you know, seeing a naked lady in the garden 3 houses away or something like that when we were young or something. is going to trigger something in us, which we're then going to latch onto. And that's then going to be a theme through our sex lives and our pleasure lives. So, you know, when people are into squeaky raincoats, for example, you know, it's a thing. It's like, this is going to stem from somewhere, probably in childhood, where, you know, that raincoat is meeting a need in us. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? You know, as long as we're consenting adults and all the rest of it, like, go for your life, whatever turns you on. But again, it's that balance that I often talk about, whether it's a direct pleasure, like, am I really into this soft, fluffy, squeaky thing because it feels good on my body? Or is it an indirect thing that's kind of having to come from the inside and tell me that I'm okay and I'm safe and I'm erotic and all the rest of it?
Okay. So like, if you because you've obviously coached people through a lot of this stuff, like, how do you think the best way for people to navigate their own kinks and that kind of thing would be?
Do you know what? So often people turn up with so much shame around whatever the kink is that they have this idea that they don't want it anymore. And I'm like, right, well, let's lean into it a little bit, actually. Like, how would it be to give yourself absolute permission to enjoy this thing and to start to unpack the idea that maybe it's not necessarily a bad, strange thing. It's just, you know, something that's really supportive to our body on one level or not. And then what I find is once the taboos kind of lifted, then often either the kink lifts itself and it's less of an obsession, or it's really normalized and it becomes, less of a thing. And it comes back to what I said right at the start, which is as soon as we shame something and suppress it, then it can leak out another way anyway. It could go from suppression to obsession.
Yeah.
So telling people we can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this. You tell a child it can't have chocolate. What does it want any more than in the world? It wants chocolate, you know. And then, of course, 30 years later, it turns out to be a chocoholic or whatever. Are we surprised? No.
Okay, so just to clarify then, so your experience is like, actually, let's flip the script, do exactly the opposite, rather than repressing this thing and letting it seep out in all these unhealthy ways. Let's do a complete 180. Let's embrace this thing as much as we can. And you find people are like healthier and happier and more positive, to use your
Absolutely. And there's a way of doing it. It might not be dive in head first. It's like, you know, let's take a trauma-informed, aware approach. So, you know, what feels edgy to do and back away from that, and what feels doable to explore in this thing. And then let's breathe when we're in it. And then let's feel what is happening in my nervous system in this experience. What is the sensation? What is it actually that's really working for me in this moment? You know, does it feel healthy? Or actually, is it a way of, you know, beating myself up a little bit? Have I got really into this kind of slight self-flagellation? You know, when we create that victim cycle in ourselves of, oh, I really shouldn't be doing it. Sometimes the kink is just doing something naughty, you know. And as soon as you stop it from being naughty anymore, maybe it's a lot less interesting. Or we can do it in a way that's healthier, you know, and so that we're less hooked or obsessed or shamed. You know, I'm not saying I'm trying to condition anyone out of their kinks. I just don't want to have people to have shame about what brings them pleasure, whatever that is. Squeaking coats, sitting on cakes, go for your life and have fun, but really enjoy it.
Yeah, exactly. So whatever the weird way through this nuanced minefield is, one of the points is like, look, just leave the shame alone, because like whatever happens, that's not helping you.
Yeah, for sure. Don't use your pleasure as a way to beat yourself up. The world will do that for you. The world will tell you that you probably shouldn't be having as much pleasure or as much time off or as much sex as you are. And if you are having sex, you probably should be doing it differently. Let's just enjoy ourselves.
Good insight. I like that one in particular. So one of the things I like that you do is you do tantric and energy body stuff with your work. I'd love to learn more about this, because it looks really cool what you can do with that.
Thank you. I think so. I started working tantrically just for myself because I needed to heal my own sexual shutdown, and the standard approach to sex just wasn't working for me. So I was like, okay, there needs to be something else out there. So when I started working with Tantra and energy and sensuality and intimacy, I didn't feel a thing. My body was numb. You know, I didn't have a clue what was going on. You know, people talking about all these sensations they're feeling in their body. I'm like, I'm not feeling anything. But I kept turning up in the room and I kept paying my money. And whilst my mind was busy saying, you're not feeling anything, you're getting it wrong, you're not doing it right, my body, in a way, it was like I was faking it till I made it, actually. So keep turning up and the body will learn whatever is really positive from that experience, whilst the mind is busy trying to distract you, telling you that you're not doing it all right. And slowly and slowly and slowly, I started to feel things in my body. But again, when I first started working with Tantra, I was so far away from kind of being orgasmic or being in pleasure that I had no expectations. But so what actually started to happen was I started to attract better people into my life, and I made better choices because I had more self-esteem, because I was becoming more embodied. And I built my new business, and that took off overnight. So it was like everything else, ping, 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 in my life really shot off because I was working on sexual energy for myself. And so
Okay,
it
let me
came
pick this
out with
apart.
creativity and success and making good decisions.
Yeah, you really got my interest with this. So is that because the self-esteem is coming up, or do you think it's more because like there's something in your energy body that's doing better, and that's having these knock-on effects to the success, or
Good
both?
question. I mean, I think it's both. I think it's both.
Yeah.
I think because our sex and our genitals and our body has been shamed for generations and generations and generations, that means ultimately that we're walking around with a part of us, an integral part of us, that we've been told is not okay. So we can't fully step into being our whole self because there's quite a big part of us that we've been taught isn't okay. You know, don't talk about sex, don't show sexual desire, definitely don't show anyone your body, don't show anyone your arousal, don't be heard having sex, you know, definitely don't, whatever we learn as kids, don't flash your knickers. You know, there's so much there telling us that our body is wrong, that we grow up going, our body is wrong. And not just our body, but our most sexual, sexy pleasure part is wrong. Our pleasure is wrong. And so as soon as we start normalizing those conversations and coming into the body and really dropping into what we feel, then things start to shift, I think.
Okay, so it's about getting rid of the shame by putting your energy into that shameful place and being in it. And I think that's the nuance of how you get rid of the shame. You sort of like move into it and like expand into it.
Again, it's that leaning in. I like the idea, leaning in. I didn't always lean in. Sometimes I dived in head first and it wasn't the safest and healthiest and happiest of way, but I found my way through. So this is now why I teach trauma-informed work, which means that we do it in a really titrated, doable way where the nervous system can kind of like deal with it, you know, and we have time to integrate and process instead of just flinging ourselves at the dangerous end of the swimming pool and then hoping that we'll, you know, flap around and swim enough.
Yeah, and of course,
we've been told that sex isn't safe. No.
well, it potentially is deadly. You know,
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly. And you can get shamed for sex, and we don't want to get shamed because then we'll get kicked out of the tribe. And what that does is it feeds into that survival fear of I'm not okay, I won't be accepted, I'll get kicked out of the tribe.
yeah, good point. There's definitely that, and there's also like, oh, you can have sex with someone with an STD, or like you can get into a relationship with someone that's a nutter that will drive you to literal insanity and then like take 30 years off your life. So it is universally a high risk thing to do. It's also a high reward if you get it right. It's the most wonderful thing in the world. But going back to the tantric stuff, so aside from like getting rid of the shame and stuff and having your self-esteem improved, you know what I wonder is like if just specifically having the energy body, just vibrating in a more healthy, strong way, that blueprint sort of like projects out into the manifested world something a little stronger. Do you think that mechanism is taking place too when you get your tantra right?
I like that term, get your tantra right. I want that on a t-shirt. When you get your tantra right, do you know what? As I said before, challenges still affect me in life. Challenges still come, but somehow it's a softer experience. And I think, yeah, energetically, I'm very much more in alignment to what is really right for me. So I don't attract unhealthy or unhelpful people anymore, really. And if and when they do turn up, they don't turn up regularly, but I'm in a really solid place to be able to deal with that experience. And I just think it's almost like, I kind of like the idea that the gods really want us to be on our happiest, healthiest, most pleasure-filled path. And the moment that we take a step onto that path, they're going to turn up and go, oh, thank God, come on, come on. And they're just going to give us what we need to help us on that path. And that also might be the tricky, challenging stuff as well, maybe. But I really think that when we're coming from our joy, then something, you know, like the waves part, you know.
No,
So
I like that.
when I first started Tantra and I was talking about my business that I'd never ran a business before. I'd worked part-time for charities. At the time, I think I was living with my mum. You know, I had very little money. I didn't have a path. I didn't have a career. I didn't even like my job. And suddenly overnight, I built a business and it boomed out of nowhere. I'd never built a business before. Money came flooding in. You know, it was a burlesque business, funnily enough. So I was teaching women sexual empowerment from the start. And, you know, it was just on one level, it was women in a dance studio with a feather boa being a bit cheeky and naughty for themselves. But again, I was seeing it ripple out in them as well. They were leaving partners that weren't satisfying for them. They were building businesses. They were really stepping out and being better parents, better people. It was really amazing, the projects that they were coming with. And on a weekly basis, women and their partners were saying to me, you're changing our lives here. And it's just because it was giving that space for us to have permission to take the sexiness out of the box. We can't be sexy anywhere else in life. We're not even really probably allowed to be as sexy as we'd like to be in the bedroom. So at that 1 hour a week in my silly little dance class, you could really tap into that sexual energy for yourself.
Beautiful, beautiful. I love the way you express that. And I love the point you've come back to a couple of times there, where like you get your energy right. And like there's this sort of like volcano that comes in your life. Like you said, you didn't have a business, never had it before, and then boom, it's gone like that. In my experience, it's like that too. Because I'm 38 now, so I'm old enough to have lived through a few highs and a few lows. And when the big highs come, Jem, it's always like there's something brewing in the inner. The energy is getting itself right, and then when it's right, it floods out like that. And you know, in a materialist world, like I think most people don't appreciate that. They think, oh, I can be happy and stuff when I get the thing. And I actually think the equation is completely switched around. I think you get the thing, and the manifested world is actually a projection of all the sum total of all the stuff going on in the inner.
And I think it ripples out, because it's not just we've got it right for us. Other people benefit when we've got it right for us.
Totally.
Now, other people feel it. Other people are inspired by it. Other people jump on it. Other people get the benefits of us when we're in our most pleasure and we're in
totally
our
right. And some people, and like people of the evil persuasion, see that goodness in you, and when you're at your most luminous, like feel most insecure and afraid, and want to take that down. I think that's also the case when the energy is really good.
Yeah, I think we've all been conditioned to do, you know, like see someone that's shining, and instead of like climbing up the ladder to meet them, try and bring them down to make ourselves feel good. And it takes a really strong person to celebrate someone who's shining and go, fuck, I celebrate you, brother. And I'm really wanting to celebrate you. And maybe I know it says a little bit of jealousy, but that's just teaching me. That's just teaching me where I'm not at the moment. And that can be a spur on. And, you know, when people who are shining then show that they're flawed humans or fail a little bit, you know, we all love sticking it on YouTube or whatever, or just kind of, you know, being able to poke holes in them in that moment. It's a conditioning that we've received, and we all have to unlearn that. It takes quite a lot to unlearn that.
Totally. Good points. So, okay. So like we're running short on time now. Before we sign out, like if you got like just one or two more minutes, like during these difficult times, what bits of insight do you have that you think will be most useful to everyone out there to make themselves happier, more whole, more real, more full, and get through this really difficult, you know, cultural, spiritual phase that we're all in right now? What do you want to share there, Jem?
Today's golden nugget. Do you know, it's always coming back to the body. Like, come back to your body. When the shit hits the fan, make space for your body. You know, when you're far too busy to have sex, make space for your body. Like, always come back, breathe into your body, feel your body, nourish your body, play with your body, dance with your body, move, breathe. You know, then we can act from that place. Like, your body is your anchor. That's the thing that's going to steer you through it all. Like, you know, stay with your body. And so that's not easy, actually, because we haven't been taught to do that. We're taught to stay in the head, which is a really good maybe computer, like getting us functioning. Our head is our secretary and our project manager, but it's also prioritizing time where we can get out of the head and into our bodies.
Such good points. And from earlier in the talk, I love the way you were saying, well, like do a 180 on all the shame and that kind of thing, and like sort of like maybe like embody that sort of thing rather than try to like repress it and let it seep out somewhere. That struck a really good chord when you were mentioning that. It's actually been, I appreciate the talk, because there's been like really good little insights all the way through that. So thank you so much for that, Jem.
Oh, you're super welcome, Richard. Thank you.
So listen, if people are interested in your work and they want to kind of follow up with you a bit more on this sort of stuff, like how is it best to connect with you?
Oh, brilliant. Well, I've got a website, www.gemayres.co.uk, and on there actually there's a free gifts page. So if you do want to get more in your body, there's videos and audios that I've put up there for embodiment practices, whether that's shaking, body-led movement, breathing, tuning into what's going on. There's like 10-minute, 5-minute audios and videos so that you can connect with yourselves. And there's some interviews and talks and other tidbits that I've done, which are up there as well. And you can, check out me and what I do and what I offer all the way through my website. And that will give you a good way that I work with solos and couples and retreats and events and online experiences and all sorts.
Great. Well, the link will be in the description for that. And, we set out this conversation with like, look, I just want to give a few kind of tidbits for people to make their life better. And I think we've got more than a few out of this conversation. So thank you very much for sharing your time, Jem. And I wish you and everyone out here like great sensual and sexual health.
I'm so happy to be asked. Thank you so much.
Cheers, Jem. Bye.
Bye.